Hi, I'm Warrick from Harder and Steenbeck, and today we're going to look at something that's really critical in airbrushing, and that is achieving the perfect surface finish. Now, for all the things that we talk about in airbrushing, with it being associated with art and all this kind of stuff, actually it's still a spray gun. And so what we can learn a lot from is the guys who use spray guns for a living, because they're only focused on that perfect finish. And everything that we do with the airbrush is going to look better, feel better, be more robust if we can achieve a similar level of perfect finish as a high-level automotive car painter. Now, achieving this standard is all about three parameters that we want to control. One, it's how far away we are from the surface. In other words, how much are we letting the spray pattern spread before it hits the surface that we're trying to paint. Secondly, how far back are we pulling the trigger? In other words, how much paint are we releasing into that spray pattern? And thirdly, how fast we're moving over the surface. Now, in previous videos, we've talked a lot about how to improve your trigger control. We're going to recap that really briefly here. So we're going to be using the Ultra 2024 for this video because it's just such a great setup on that 0.45 nozzle. Easy to use for everything, and really what we're talking about here is quality of coverage on a basic surface finish like a prime or a base coat. I've got some Army Painter primer already developed in the airbrush here, and what we're going to do is again just look at our very basic of basics on the trigger technique. So first thing I want you to do, on a piece of paper, press down to start the air, start moving the airbrush and pull the trigger back to start the paint flow. Push it forward to stop it, and then stop the air. That's the most basic trigger stroke there is. Now let's look at how we build up a panel. The first stroke, about a fist distance away, pretty reasonable pullback. If you want to use the prime setting, do. Otherwise, just use a free trigger. The next stroke you want to make, you want to aim at the edge of that strip with the center of the next stroke. And the same with the next. Same with the next. Same with the next. Same with the next. And what that gives us is this very uniform coverage on this area that we've been painting. Now the reason for this is every airbrush, when it paints, it has a cone which is most concentrated in the middle, progressively degrades to the outer edges. So if you've got that spray pattern, and you want to make sure that your coverage is perfectly even on that panel, you don't want to do it so that you've got one spray pattern here and the next one there. If you do one here and the next one 50% overlap and 50% overlap, it evens everything out absolutely perfectly on the panel. And so the first stroke you put down should not be wet enough that you can't get a bit more paint onto it. And this is where we're going to go onto a model. So what we've got here is the wonderful Predator. It's a great one for this exercise because it's just a flat top, a flat panel, and it really exposes any unevennesses in application because it's simply a flat panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same stroke with this 50% overlap, and what we're looking for, and here's the key, is when you do that second stroke, you're looking for that satin finish to develop on that junction where the two strokes are overlapping. And then you progressively keep doing that, and you'll have a perfect coverage over that flat panel. We're going to give it a second coat. Now, I hope you can see it, but it's got an ever such a slight satiny sheen to it. And that is pretty much, there we go. And that is really, there we go, that's what we want to see. Just, hopefully you can see this, but it's got a perfect satin sheen to it. And that's exactly what you want to have when you're trying to put down a paint finish that is thick enough that it's got coverage, but no thicker than it needs to be to give you that coverage. The reason why you don't want it to be any thicker is because you never want to lose any detail in the surface moldings that you paid for when you bought that wonderful model. Okay, so that was a demonstration of what we ought to be doing. Now, what are the mistakes that we could make that would compromise that result? Now, the first thing is being too far away. If we're too far away, if you can imagine when the airbrush atomizes paint, it splits it into thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands, probably, of tiny little droplets. Those little droplets have got a pretty intense ratio of surface area to volume. There's a lot of surface area, not a lot of volume. In other words, they dry out pretty fast on their journey from the airbrush to the model. If you make that journey too far, then by the time they get there, they're almost dry. And when they hit the model, they've got no fluidity left in them to flow out flat, and that's why you get this kind of rough surface. It's not desirable on a model, especially if you're going to go after that with a brush paint, because the brush just doesn't flow over it very nicely. Also, it's hard to subsequently coat with another airbrush coat and achieve a better finish than the ground coat you put down with this mistake in it. The solution to it is you always want to see that satin finish develop, not a gloss, just a satin, and then you know it's wet enough that it can flow out flat. You can also get the same problem of it being too dry by being at the correct distance but not pulling enough paint into it. The other way that you can get the same problem is if you're painting like this. Too much like this, just too much speed with the airbrush. What that does is it makes a lot of turbulence into that spray pattern, and it causes the spray pattern to dry out more quickly on its way to the model as well. Also not good. Everything wants to be this nice controlled movement, not too fast, not too slow, and that will give you this perfect finish. If you move too slowly with a given trigger movement, then of course you're going to get too much of a wet buildup. That might look like this. So if you look here at the top of the model, you can see that's absolutely glossy up there. That is an over application. Normally, if you just over apply like this, it flows out flat, doesn't run anywhere, it's not a massive problem. Problems can be when you go a little bit further than that and it starts to sag, or it starts to obscure and fill surface detail. Worst case, also, a very, very wet coat tends to not adhere quite as well as a coat that's just done with the satin finish. Now, the other thing that can get in the way of this, and it is something that I see people doing fairly frequently, particularly in modeling, is they just get too close when they're looking to put down general coverage. Now, the airbrush isn't the same as a paintbrush. Obviously, with a paintbrush, you're always working at that similar distance that's controlled by the length of the bristles, but often with the airbrush, you'll be working much further away. Generally, for painting models that are small enough to hold in your hand, the furthest distance you're going to be is normally something like a hand's width away. Further than that, you get this over-drying problem. Closer than that, for coverage, you're probably not going to be giving that spray pattern enough time to spread to give you coverage that you can work with. And you run the risk of painting in lines. And when you paint with lines, it's really quite difficult to hit the edge of that line to get that perfect coverage that's just layering up nicely as you progressively work over the panel. Now, if we're looking for flat panels which are a little bit more complicated, so they've got some different facets on them like we see on the front of this Predator, you can get around that fairly easily, not by trying to get in really close and under things, but just by manipulating the angle that the spray is going to meet the surface at, whilst still sticking to that basic principle of stroke, 50% overlap, 50% overlap. And the results will surprise you as to how consistently good they'll come out on something that can be really quite complex. So we're starting out at the top. Again, 50% overlap. I'm just moving the faces of the model around a little bit to suit what we're aiming at with the airbrush. And again, always looking for this 50% overlap and looking for that satin finish when we're laying the primer down. If I try to hold this in the correct light here, again you can see we've got this ever such a slight satin finish on that front edge there, and that's going to dry beautifully uniform and therefore give you a really good ground for any subsequent work that you're going to do on that model. Now let's take a look at some other shapes that give us different challenges for getting a smooth, consistent coverage finish down. A gun barrel's one, but actually you just approach it exactly the same way. So what I see sometimes people doing is they try to do this kind of thing where they're kind of shaking the airbrush around and gradually rotating it. and there's just no control over where you've been, where you might be, where you're going to go next, how many times you're going to go over it. So I'd really encourage you to approach it just the same way again. So just nice strokes, open up, close, open up, close, open up, close. And that is going to, again, give you a beautiful satin finish on that gun barrel that's going to be perfect for anything that's going to follow on after that piece of work. So what I'd like to recap on this one is what's the essence of the perfect system for getting great coverage? And it's this. This is the key thing. Press down, keep it down, move the airbrush. Once you start it to move, open the paint up, shut the paint off before you finish the movement, and then return with that 50% overlap. And what it should sound like and look like is this. And what that is it's this thing of moving and starting to pull the trigger once you've begun to move, so you don't get a pooling at the start of the stroke because you're already moving. And then stopping the triggers, pushing it forward, not stopping the air, but pushing it forward before you stop moving so you don't get any pooling at the end of the stroke. Changing direction, opening it up again once you're moving, closing it before you stop moving. That is the essence of a perfect technique of a car painter. If you can replicate that as an airbrusher in as many of your strokes as possible, you're going to have this flawless coverage all the time. So for example, if we again come back to our paper pad and look at that system again, it looks like this. So you notice it's this kind of beautiful, hypnotic, kind of rhythmic way of painting where you move paint, stop paint, change direction. Move paint, stop paint, change direction. And that ensures that you never get this problem. This is when you change direction when the paint is still flowing. You get these darker edges to the pattern because you're pausing as you're changing direction. And that will, on a non-porous surface, cause pooling. So just get into the habit of rocking that trigger finger forward and back every time you change direction. And then you'll have this perfect surface finish. So again, just to recap, always looking for a satin finish, always rocking off the trigger when you're changing direction, always starting to move the airbrush before you start to throw paint. For your coverage, for your panel painting, as long as you adhere to that, you're going to have perfect results every time. Because this is the basis and the ground of everything subsequent, I'd really encourage you, especially if you're at the start of your learning process with the airbrush, to try to get that skill really well understood and really well practiced, because it's going to be the basis upon which you build the whole rest of your painting process on every piece that you do. I hope it's been helpful. It is a basic technique, but it is so foundational that I'd really encourage you to spend a bit of time perfecting it. And trust me, when you get the ability to make that flowing way of painting like a professional car painter, it's so satisfying, especially when you see the results it will consistently give you when you develop it as a habit. Thanks for being with us. Any questions, please ask us. We'll always endeavor to answer all of them, and hopefully we'll see you on the next video.